Well, good morning, good morning. We are starting a brand new series today called Times Like These, and I'm excited about it because no matter what your situation is, your age, your situation, your gender, your work, whatever, it doesn't really matter, whether even if you're a follower of Jesus or not, the three things we're going to talk about in this series are the three things that every person faces. We're going to talk about the pressure to compromise and when you should and when you shouldn't. Next week, we're going to talk about the risks that we take because everybody at some point in their life is faced with taking a risk. And then finally, we're going to talk about the opposition that we face because everybody always comes up against hurdles and burdens and situations that kind of push back against them. And so I'm glad that you're here. I hope that you'll be with us for all three parts, whether you're in the room or online. This is going to be a great series. Today, we're going to start off talking about the idea of compromise. And I know, depending on where you're from and kind of your mindset and background, that word carries a lot of connotations. For some people, the idea of compromise is like, hey, that's a good thing. That's how you get stuff done. That's how you make arrangements and make deals and things like that. Other people may feel just the opposite. No, compromise is a terrible thing. That's how you lose things. That's how things that you shouldn't give up are lost. And so we got a lot of different mindsets when it comes to compromise. But the truth is, compromise is good and bad, and it just depends on the situation, right? I mean, if you go all the way back to 1787, the Connecticut Compromise was a good compromise. It allowed the United States to adopt the Constitution. The smaller states were fighting with the bigger states about how they would be represented, and they finally compromised and said, no matter how big the state is, each state gets 2 senators. And so all the states then decided, okay, we can live with that, and they signed the U.S. Constitution. So we have a Constitution because of a compromise. That was a good thing. There was another compromise that happened, though, in 1938, and it happened by Neville Chamberlain. He was the Prime Minister of England at the time, and what happened was the nation of Germany had started to invade other regions of Europe. And so Neville Chamberlain goes and meets with Hitler, and they reach a compromise. That was a bad compromise because most historians look back and say, look, if England and the other allies had held their ground right then and right there, World War II may not have happened. Or if it did happen, it would have happened in a completely different way. That was a bad compromise. And you might think, well, those are interesting, but they have little to nothing to do with me today. And that's true. But you're in the same boat, aren't you? I mean, there's compromises and opportunities to compromise in your life that really make sense and are really good decisions. And then there's opportunities and pressure to compromise that's a really bad decision. So to give you an example, if your friends and family are all going to lunch together and they invite you and it's a restaurant you hate, well, you just need to go, right? You're going to hang out with your friends and your family. That's a good compromise. It's not my favorite place, but these are my favorite people, so I'm going to go. If you're at work and everybody's going along with it, but you know in your heart it's wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. But everybody's going along with it, and you go along with it too. That's a bad compromise because you're trading in your own principles. That's a bad compromise. So how do you know? How do you tell? I can't answer for everybody, but I can answer for me. I grew up going to church from a little kid. I mean, from the time I was born, as a matter of fact, I went from the same church from the day I was born till I was 22 years old. I went to the exact same church all the time, whole time, every Sunday. And I was difficult as a child in Sunday school. Like they had these Sunday school classes and they were led by volunteers. I mean, the poor people weren't even paid. And I made jokes and I was distracting and I fought with other kids and I yelled at my brother and I did all the stuff that I'm sure every teacher thought, please get this kid out of my class, right? Just get him on to the next grade or get him out of here. I was that kid. But somehow, some way, in junior high, I had a teacher. His name was Josh Galindo. And I'll be honest with you, I don't remember much of what Josh said, but I do remember one thing he said, and it has helped me, and I wish I could say that I've always followed this, but it has helped me as I've had to navigate choices and consequences and compromise in my life. And he said it this way, it was very simple. He said, when you're in a situation where you're being asked to compromise, you really need to ask yourself a very simple question. Is this a matter of preference or a matter of principle? Because if it's only a matter of preference, you should compromise. You should go along. You should get along. It's not that big a deal. But if it's a matter of principle, you should never compromise. You should never go along. No matter what the stakes are, no matter what's going against you, you shouldn't compromise if it's a matter of principle. I don't know about you, but my life has gotten a lot more complicated since I was 12. It's a lot more complex. There's a lot more going on. And to be honest with you, there's a lot more people in my ear about what I should do and what I should say and what I should think and what I should believe. And it seems like there's a lot more pressure associated with all of those things. And everybody's got an opinion about what my opinion should be, right? I mean, that's kind of the world we live in. How do you decide? What do you do? When you start to feel the pressure, right? When it starts to push on you to go along, what do you use? And the guy I want to introduce you today, I'm going to tell you about him in just a moment. His name is Mordecai. Mordecai landed where I think we all want to be. We all want to be in that place where when it's smart to compromise, hey, we're flexible, we're easygoing, we're easy to get along with. But when it's about principle that we hold fast, we don't want to be the person that always gives in, that always folds, that always goes along, even on important things. And Mordecai landed exactly where we need to be. He landed in this place where he was compromising his preferences, but he was committed to his principles. Now, if you've got a Bible, we're going to be in the book of Esther, Esther chapter 2, actually, in just a moment. And I want to tell you a little bit about what's going on because this is kind of a unique situation that Mordecai finds himself in. Mordecai grew up in 5th century BC, Persia. Now, I know you know all of the 5th century BC Persian history, so I won't bore you with everything, but let me give you just a quick little hint, a little inside scoop on what was going on in 5th century Persia. Mordecai lived in a city or a citadel called Susa, and Susa was the capital of the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire, if you want to kind of get a picture in your head, how big was it? If you took the United States, the land mass of the United States, and doubled it, that was how much area the Persian Empire ruled over. And most scholars say that if you think about it in terms of people, that somewhere between 40 and 45% of the population of the planet at that time was ruled by the Persian Empire. So almost 1 out of every 2 people alive were subjects of the Persian Empire. I mean, this thing was vast and it was powerful and the emperor was wealthy and they had a lot of control. And this is where Mordecai lived. He lived in 5th century BC, Persia, in the capital city of the Persian Empire. And the way he got there was not the way that anybody would want to get there. You see, 100 years ago from Mordecai's time, 100 years before Mordecai, a nation called Babylon had invaded his homeland, his native land of Judea. And not only did Babylon come in and conquer Judea, they hauled away everybody they thought of value. If you were educated, if you were wealthy, if you were young, if you were healthy and had potential, they grabbed all of them and hauled them all back to Babylonia. And that's where Mordecai's probably parents and even maybe grandparents ended up. Well, in that 100 years' time, the Persian Empire went to war with the Babylonian Empire and the Persians won. And so from Mordecai's standpoint, he, his parents, and his grandparents have always been the subjects of somebody else. We've never lived at home. We've always been ruled by someone else. And in ancient times, if you were ruled by an empire, in some ways, you were basically a slave to the empire. Now, the one thing Mordecai had going for him, one thing he had going for him was he worked at the palace. He had a pretty good job. So he lived in the capital and he worked at the palace. It'd be like living in Washington, D.C. This was kind of his situation. And that's what you need to know about Mordecai. And look at Esther chapter 2, verse 5 for a little bit more of his story and what was going on in his life. It says this, "Now, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, the king of Judah." That's a lot of names and places for what I just told you, okay? Verse 7, "Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. So she was an orphan. He took his cousin into his house. This young woman, who is also known as Esther, she also had a Persian name. Hadassah was her Jewish name. Esther was her Persian name. She had a lovely figure and she was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died." Now, so that kind of gives you a little bit of context. This is a broken family. They don't have a lot of people around them. They're strangers in this strange land. They work for this empire. And what happened next is one of those things, it is so crazy that it has to be true. Like nobody would make this up. Xerxes is the emperor. And he throws this incredibly lavish party. And one thing you need to know about Xerxes, he was more of a partier than he was a politician, okay? He was better at throwing parties than he was at running the country. But that's who Xerxes was. And he brought in people for months. This party went on. And you think, okay, that doesn't sound right. How can a party go on for months? Well, basically what happened was each week he would bring people in from different parts of the empire. And he brought them in for two reasons. He brought them in to entertain them and have a good time. And he also brought them in to remind them that I'm your emperor. And this is how wealthy and powerful and vast the Persian Empire is. Don't think about going against me. And so he brings these people in and he has this lavish celebration every week, and it goes on and on for months because there's so many different people that have to be brought in and so many people that are being entertained. And during one of these, Xerxes, probably drunk, decides, you know what, it's not enough to show him the palace. It's not enough to show him the soldiers and the army and everything else. I want my wife to come out here, because he had a trophy wife. Her name was Vashti. And he said, bring Vashti out. Bring her out. I want to parade her in front of everybody. I want her to see that not only in the emperor, I got the best looking wife too. And Vashti said, no. Which a lot of you are thinking, well, good for her. And you're right, but in 5th century BC Persia, that was not good for her. That was Vashti's last day as queen. And the next day, everybody sobers up and they kind of scratch their heads and they realize, well, wait a minute, we got to have a queen. Like, we got an emperor, he's got to have a queen. We got to fix this. And so they did the Persian version of the Bachelor show, right? I mean, they went out and they're like, okay, go out and find anybody that's hot. Bring them in, all right? Just bring them all in, and then we're just going to keep throwing them at the king until he says, I like that one. And so that's exactly what they do. And one of the girls was Hadassah, or Esther. And in what had to be for her just a head-spinning reversal of situations, she goes from being the orphaned cousin of Mordecai to the queen of the Persian Empire. He chose her. And all of a sudden, everything has changed. I mean, you can imagine going, like I said, from an orphan to a palace servant that's taking care of you to being the queen of the empire. And Mordecai's last words to her, he was very, very clear about this. He said, Esther, no matter what you do, no matter what happens, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. Don't tell them where you're from. Don't tell them what you believe. Don't tell them about your background. Just keep your mouth shut when it comes to all of those things. You see, Mordecai, and Esther for that matter, they had fit in. Right? They had basically they had Persian names, they had Persian jobs, they lived in the capital of the empire of Persia, and they found a way to just get along and go along, right? I mean, they didn't want to stick out, they didn't want any other attention, they had quieted down their convictions, they had hidden kind of their race and their ethnic background, and they had kind of buried their faith under layers of compromise and said, just don't make any waves. Don't give anybody any reason to think any different. You look like you're Persian, you act like you're Persian, just stay that way. Don't let anyone know. And before you're too hard on them. Don't we feel that sometimes? I mean, I do. Especially if you're a follower of Jesus, don't you sometimes feel the pressure to just get along and go along? Don't say anything. Don't do anything. Don't give any reason for people to raise the red flag or ask you a question or anything like that. And part of it's not your fault. I mean, I'm not trying to be a critic and I'm not judging or anything else, but we live in a society that says we value tolerance, and that anybody can do and believe anything, and your job is to applaud what anybody does, and we're going to be very tolerant, except for those tolerant people get uptight when somebody comes along and says, well, the thing that I believe is that there's one Savior and one solution to all the problems of mankind. Well, wait a minute, that's exclusive. We don't like that. That's not very tolerant. And it starts to create pressure. And you and I feel it. And sometimes, like Mordecai and Esther, it's just easier to look Persian, act Persian, and get along with Persians, isn't it? And it's hard. And you don't want to stand out, and you don't want to cause problems, and you feel the pressure. And you got to decide, I'm going to compromise, am I going to commit? That's exactly where they were. And when life goes on, actually about 5 years go on before this next episode. If you've still got your Bible open, look at Esther chapter 3. Because in Esther chapter 3, something happens. The system gets upset, so to speak. It says this: after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and elevated him and gave him a seat of honor higher than all the other nobles. And just kind of a little parentheses. Basically, he made this guy Haman his number 2. Like, I'm in charge and I like to party, so you do the hard stuff, right? I mean, that's basically what Haman's job is. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. And the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it, to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. I'll stop there for just a second. Now, Mordecai, he had a moment. He had been going along up until this point. He had been compromising. He had been playing the part. He had been getting along so that he could go along. He just kind of did what he was supposed to do. But finally, for some reason at this point, something in him just snapped and he goes, not anymore. I can't do it. I cannot bow to this man and treat him like he is a god. I will not. And though everybody else around him is bowing, he is standing ramrod straight, sticking out like a sore thumb. And it reminds me of August Landmesser. Do you know who this guy is? August Landmesser lived in Germany in the late 1930s. And this famous picture, during a Nazi rally when Hitler came by, everyone in the crowd gave the Heil Hitler salute except for one guy, and look at him circled in red. He's just standing there with his arms crossed. And almost all of us think, oh, I'd love to be that guy. I want to be that guy. You know how it worked out for August Landmesser? He didn't make it to 1940. But I think that's exactly what it looked like when when Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. Everybody around him, because there's probably hundreds of palace officials, and they're all bowing down, and it is so noticeable. And it's not just one time, and it's not like he's hiding in the corner. And I know he could have rationalized it, right? He could have told himself, you know what, I don't really mean it. You know, like your kids used to do. Well, I didn't really mean it. I just did it because everybody else was. You know, I don't really mean it. I don't really think he's a god. I don't really believe all that stuff, but I'm just going to go ahead and bow so that it looks good and they'll leave me alone. And he just couldn't do it. He couldn't compromise here. There was a principle that he was committed to, that he could not treat another person like they were God. He just wouldn't do it. And it cost him. I'm sure he knew there's going to be some consequences. I mean, this was the king's command. And he ignored it. And all the people are bowing, and all his friends, all his coworkers, hey, just come on, bow down. Everybody else is doing it, come on. What are you doing? A couple of days go by, and they're like, why would you do this? You're asking for it. And he gives them an interesting answer. He says, because I'm a Jew. I can't do it. And word eventually gets back of his resistance to Haman. Because Haman, maybe he didn't see it, maybe he didn't notice, maybe he wasn't paying all that much attention. He was just basking in the fact that everybody was bowing to him. But he found out that Mordecai was resisting. And resistance is so important. See, this is where this touches your life. You're never going to have to bow to a Persian emperor. You probably are never going to have your life on the line for your faith. I hope not. But resistance still matters. And I'm going to use the word resistance, but I want to get one thing clear. See, sometimes if you hear resistance, we tend to think of standing up for my rights. That's right, I'm going to get what I deserve, and this is mine, and you can't take that from me, and this, I'm an American, and this is my right, blah, blah, blah. No, that's not what I'm talking about at all. As a matter of fact, if you're a follower of Jesus, you know this. One of the things we're known for is giving up our rights. One of the things we're known for is being humble. One of the things we're known for is, no, you first. What do you need? Out of love, I want to love you, I want to honor you, I'm willing to give up my rights for you. That's not what resistance is. Resistance is something else. Resistance is that thing in you, like Mordecai, that makes you stand up straight when everybody else is bowing. And the best picture of it that I can think of for our context, you probably remember the story. Peter and John were some of the earliest followers of Jesus. And after Jesus had died and been resurrected, they went around telling everybody what he had done. They said, you know what? The Romans and the Jewish rulers, they crucified him, but he rose from the dead, and life has changed because of it. And they got in trouble because they were so persistent and so consistent with this. They dragged them in front of their version of the court. And they told him, you are trying to make us responsible for his death, and you need to stop. Do you remember what their answer was? They said, judge for yourself. In other words, you do what you have to do. We're going to do what we have to do. We are going to obey God, not men. That's exactly where Mordecai was. This wasn't about my rights. This wasn't about my privileges. This wasn't about getting what was due me. This was, I know what God has said, and I know what you're saying, and they are in conflict, and I am going to choose to go with God. That's what resistance looks like. Haman, he was mad, especially when he found out why. He says, you won't bow down because you're a Jew? And I'm sure Mordecai in the back of his mind knew there were going to be some consequences. I highly doubt he knew what they were going to be, though. Because Mordecai, Haman, like a good mobster, he goes, oh no, we're not just going to kill you. We're going to kill you, we're going to kill your family, and we're going to kill everybody else that's Jewish too. And you think, oh, that's crazy. Who would do that? But there's an actual record of him and the Emperor Xerxes sitting around getting drunk on a patio talking about the fact that the best answer to this insubordination is to wipe out the entire Jewish race. Shocking. And I'm sure for Mordecai, it was, I thought maybe I'd get in trouble. Maybe I'd lose my job. Maybe I'd be thrown in jail. Maybe even they'd execute me, but I just had to, this was my moment. I just couldn't do it. Here, now, I've got to make a stand. And I knew he thought it would cost him, but I doubt he thought it would cost him everyone. Something about this whole thing, though, this resistance has rekindled his faith. Because when he hears about it, he does really the only two things he can do. He prays, and he reaches out to his Jewish cousin, who happens to be the queen of the emperor of Persia. And because they can't talk to each other as palace protocol and all this stuff, it goes back and forth between them in messengers. And you can kind of tell as you read these messages that Esther was a little confused, which she had every right to be. It's kind of like, wait a minute, you're the guy that told me, years ago, don't tell anyone. Hide it, get along, go along, be Persian, act Persian, live Persian because, we don't want to stand out. You told me this. Now you're causing all these problems. You need to get with the program. What are you doing? And he comes back and they go back and forth. And the final message that Mordecai sends is probably the most famous passage in this book. And you find it in chapter 4, verse 12. He says it this way. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back his answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. In essence, Mordecai told her, this is the time. I've made my stand, and you need to make yours. And in that message, he told her some things that I think apply to you in your moment. Because you're going to have, if you're not already in the middle of a Mordecai moment right now, you're going to have one where you feel the pressure to give in, to go along, to be quiet when you should speak, and to speak when you should have been quiet. You're going to feel these pressures. And he tells her something just so important, so important. First thing he tells her is, we are not exempt. We're not exempt. If you are a follower of Jesus, it's going to come down moment after moment when you have this Mordecai situation where you're either going to give up your belief and go along, or you're going to stay committed. You're not exempt. It doesn't matter how good you are at being smooth and negotiating and not fighting and being friendly, and you should be all of those things. It doesn't matter. There's still going to come a moment where it's going to be on the line for you. There's no way to hide. It's going to find you. If you're a follower of Jesus, it's going to find all of us. We're not exempt. The second thing he tells her is God's purposes will be done. God's purpose is going to be done. He says, hey, you may opt out of this, but God is still going to do what God does. God is still going to save. God is still going to redeem. God is still going to be victorious. God's purposes are still going to come about. There's no way you can stop that. This doesn't depend on you. Which leads me to realize something, and I hope you're getting this too. When you're in that moment, this moment is actually an opportunity for you. because God's going to accomplish what he's going to accomplish. This is your opportunity. And if you opt out when things get hard, you are the one that loses out. Because this resistance, we'll talk about in just a second, it actually builds your faith. God's going to accomplish what he's going to do. This is an opportunity for you. The final thing he tells her is don't let doubt win out. Don't let the doubts win out. I know it doesn't look good. I know it looks bad. The circumstances look like there's no way out. It looks like there's no answer. It looks like we've hit a dead end. And you know what? God specializes in dead end, no answer situations. So many times he takes what nobody thought could happen and he reverses it and he turns it into something that nobody saw coming. He says, don't let your doubts win out. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean God isn't about to do it. And so he sends her this reply, and his faith has been rekindled and refired. And for so many of us, we can see ourselves in that Mordecai moment. I don't know what yours is. I don't know where you're facing that struggle. Maybe it's pressure at work. Maybe your coworkers are trying to get you to go along and do something, and you know, this is not what God has for me. This is not God's plan, but you know the pressure is coming, and you know there's gonna be some fallout if you don't. Maybe there's a relationship that you're in and they're pressuring you to do or to be or to act or to be involved in things. And you're like, I don't want that. I don't want to do that. I know I'm not supposed to do that. But I feel this pressure like if you love me, you would. And I don't want to be there. Maybe it's not even that complicated. Maybe it's a relationship that's broken. And as a follower of Jesus, you know there's something between you. And you also know that you should be the one to go and initiate, to apologize, to offer forgiveness, to begin to repair the relationship because you know that that's God's desire and God's design. But pride doesn't want you to, and other people say that you shouldn't, and there's this pressure to just wait and see what happens instead of follow through with what God has said. See, you're probably in a Mordecai moment right now because this is life. And if you're not, you will be soon. And it's all about how you respond. Now I want to put a time out here for just a second. I want you, if you're here and you've got a phone that's got texting on it, I want you to get your phone out. Because we're going to do something in just a minute because we're going to pray for each other. So get your phone out, find it, just have it handy. Because I'm going to have you text something in just a minute because we want to pray for each other today. But as you're doing that, you understand this whole idea where God's going to come through and this opportunity that you have in the middle of this pressure is important and how you respond really matters. Responding is your responsibility. God's responsibility is to save. God's responsibility is to reverse the situation. God's responsibility is to redo everything. Your responsibility is to respond. And so there's a couple of things about responding. They're pretty straightforward. They're pretty simple. The first is that resistance matters. And I've shared this with you already. Resistance absolutely matters. Not standing up for my rights, but standing with God. When I know God has said something, that I'm going to stand with it and I'm going to stay with it. Because as I said, it builds your faith. It's not, and I hate to tell you this, you're not the hero of the story. Jesus is the hero of the story. He's always the hero of the story. But your response matters so much, and it builds your faith when you resist, and it breaks you through to a new level of connection with him when you are willing to stand by and when you are willing to stand with, and you know there could be some negative things that come across as a result of this. It builds you. Second thing is decide now what you'll do then. When it comes to this idea of I got to respond, decide now what you're going to do then. See, I can't prove this, but I think that Mordecai, he probably had a little heads up. He probably knew the day before, maybe the week before, that this was coming. Just like you do. Most of the time when you feel the pressure and you feel the pressure to compromise when you should stay committed, you know it's coming, right? You know the moment is coming. The meeting is going to happen or we're going to get together or this is going to come about or whatever it might be. You know it's coming. So decide now what you're going to do. Because you know what happens when you wait until you're in the moment? Unfortunately, for many of us, the loudest voice wins. So decide now what you're going to do when you face that moment of compromise. Don't wait till you get there. That's part of the way that you respond. And then the third thing is to stand up with God and he will stand with you. It's a faith piece. It's a recognition. I am not on my own. You see, God created this beautiful world and it's broken. It is. It doesn't take too long to see that or experience that. And this broken world that we lived in is not what God intended. God intended for it to be a beautiful place with us enjoying full life with him. That was God's intention in creation. And we came along and we broke it. And so concerned was he, and so moved by this brokenness, that he comes to us in the form of Jesus. And he says, I will help you carry the brokenness. I will show you what life is supposed to be like. So much so that he goes to the extent of allowing that brokenness to become an offering. He gave up his own life that we might have life. Because that's what God does. God moves, God saves, God restores. God will have his victory. His purposes will be done. But this is your hour. This is your moment. Don't compromise. Stay committed. Have a defiant dedication to what God has called you to. Don't settle for compromise. And don't think for a minute that you're going to be able to do this on your own. You're not. And I don't mean that as an insult. It's actually a great grace that God shows us, that if we are left to our own, most of the time we fall short and fail. But also don't think for a minute that God won't be at your side and stand with you when you are willing to stand for him. You see, everything changes when God is involved. The story always takes an unexpected turn. And you might be wondering, well, what happens next? I mean, what happens when he's standing up and they're getting ready for this? Well, you need to come back next week for part 2 of Times Like These, because this is an incredible story. Or you could read the book of Esther this week and find out for yourself, which I encourage you to do. But here's what I want you to do now. There's a phone number that's going to pop up on the screen. I want you to put that in your phone right now. Go ahead and just put it in like you're going to text to it. What I want to invite you to do this morning is to text in a word. One word. You don't have to tell us your story. You don't have to tell us your name. You don't have to tell us any of those things. I want you to text in one word that represents the place where you are feeling the pressure to compromise, where you would like your church family to pray with you and pray around you for this thing so that I don't give up what I know I need to stand firm with. Where do you need to stay committed? And what we're going to do at the end of the service is take a few minutes and pray together as a church family over these things. We're not going to embarrass anyone. It's not going to be tied to your name, none of that stuff. But we want to take this moment and pray strength from God into our hearts and into our lives as we realize and recognize, God, I need your help. In this area of my life, I am tempted to compromise and I don't want to. I need your help. So as we sing these next few worship songs, text to that number the word or 2 words that represent the place where you need to stand firm. Let me pray with you for just a moment.